A single tree, a sacred memory, suddenly silenced. When Professor Evelyn Kim's living tribute to a fallen friend is brutally destroyed by co-decree, a quiet academic's grief ignites into a blaze of fury. You won't believe the dark secrets and blatant disregard she uncovers in her relentless pursuit of justice. Don't miss what happens next. The scream of a chainsaw was the first violation. It ripped through the crisp, otherwise tranquil. September morning in the Maple Leaf district of Seattle. A sound so alien to Evelyn Kim's usually serene Saturday that it jolted her upright in bed. Her heart hammered against her ribs. A frantic bird trapped. For a moment, she thought it was a nightmare, a lingering echo of some forgotten dread. But the sound came again, a guttural, grinding roar that vibrated through the floorboards of her modest, lovingly kept craftsman home. It was too close, far too close. Evelyn, 45, a history professor at the University of Washington, usually treasured these quiet weekend mornings. They were for sipping genmaicha tea, for poring over student papers, or for simply gazing out at the magnificent weeping willow in her front yard. The willow, a sprawling sentinel of green, was more than just a tree. It was a living monument of a repository of memory. She'd planted it 22 years ago. A slender sapling then, in honor of her colleague and friend, David, who had perished in the North Superior on 9/11. The tree's graceful, drooping branches were like constant, gentle tears, a perpetual, silent lament. A sudden, horrifying premonition clenched her stomach. Throwing on a robe, she scrambled down the stairs, her mind racing. Not the willow, please, not the willow. She flung open the front door, and the sight that greeted her stole her breath, punched the air from her lungs. Two men in bright orange vests were there, one wielding the still screaming chainsaw, its blade biting deep into the thick, familiar trunk of her willow. The other man was gathering already severed branches, his movements efficient, impersonal. The air was thick with the scent of fresh-cut wood and gasoline, a nauseating perfume of destruction. "Stop! What are you doing? Stop it!" Evelyn shrieked, her voice hoarse with disbelief and rising panic. She stumbled down the porch steps, her bare feet cold on the dew-damp grass, heedless of the sawdust already blanketing the ground. The man with the chainsaw, startled, let the engine die. The sudden silence was almost as shocking as the noise. He pulled off his protective earmuffs, a questioning look on his face. "Ma'am, that's my tree." "What are you doing?" Evelyn repeated, gesturing wildly towards the deep, weeping gash in the willow's trunk. Several major limbs already lay on the lawn like amputated appendages, their leaves trembling in the slight morning breeze. Before the worker could answer, a new voice cut in, firm and authoritative. "There seems to be a misunderstanding, Mid Kim, or perhaps a willful disregard for community standards." Evelyn whirled around to see Bill Redford, the 58-year-old head of the North Haven Homeowners Association, striding across her lawn. He was a portly man, his face usually florid, today set in lines of stern disapproval. He wore his weekend uniform of a pressed polo shirt and khaki shorts, a clipboard palaveras, PNG in his hand as if it were a scepter. "Bill, you authorized this," Evelyn demanded, her voice trembling with a mixture of rage and incredulity. "Without any warning, without any discussion." "Warning," Redford scoffed, adjusting his glasses. "Evelyn, we've had numerous discussions about your overgrown landscaping. That willow, specifically. It's become an eyesore. Frankly, its roots are probably threatening the sidewalk, and it significantly detracts from the neighborhood's aesthetic appeal. The HOA board voted. It's a hazard and a blight." "A blight," Evelyn felt a hysterical laugh bubble up. "This tree is a memorial. It has been here for over 2 decades. It's perfectly healthy." She swept her arm toward the vibrant green canopy, now tragically diminished. "It doesn't detract, Bill. It defines this corner. Many people have told me how much they love it." "Some people," Redford corrected smoothly, "are overly sentimental. Others appreciate a tidy, uniform appearance, which is what this HOA strives to maintain. Property values. Evelyn, we have to consider property values. He tapped his clipboard. The decision was made according to HOA bylaws. Section 7, subsection C, landscaping deemed detrimental to community aesthetics or posing potential hazard can be removed by HOA directive after due notification. Notification? I received no notification, Evelyn cried, her mind reeling. She was meticulous with her mail, with her emails, something like this, a threat to David's tree. She would never have missed. When was this due notification sent? Redford flipped a page on his clipboard. A letter was mailed out 3 weeks ago, and an email reminder last week. Standard procedure. Evelyn shook her head, numb. I never got them. I check my mail every day. My email too. There's been nothing from the HOA about this. A chilling thought occurred to her. Are you sure it was sent to the correct address? My correct email. Redford gave a dismissive wave of his hand. Of course, we have your details on file. Perhaps you overlooked it. He turned to the workmen. All right, gentlemen, let's get this finished. We're on a schedule. The chainsaw operator hesitated, looking from Redford to Evelyn's stricken face. No, don't you dare. Evelyn pleaded, stepping closer to the wounded tree, as if she could shield it with her own body. Bill, this is barbaric. This tree means everything to me. There has to be some mistake. Redford's expression hardened. The only mistake, Evelyn, was allowing that monstrosity to dominate your yard for so long. It's coming down. Today. He nodded curtly to the workers. Proceed. The chainsaw roared back to life. Evelyn flinched as if struck. Tears welled in her eyes, hot and furious. This wasn't just about bylaws or aesthetics. This was a desecration. As the teeth of the saw bit once more into the willow's flesh, a piece of Evelyn's heart was being violently torn away with it. She watched, helpless, as another massive branch groaned, cracked, and thundered to the earth. The scent of raw, living wood was overwhelming. The date, September 9th, 2023, seared itself into her brain. Almost the anniversary. The irony was a cruel twist of the knife. Bill Redford, with his petty tyranny and clipboard authority, had no idea what he was truly destroying. But Evelyn did, and as the willow fell, piece by piece, a cold, hard resolve began to crystallize in her chest, displacing the initial shock and grief. This was not over. He had taken her tree. He had violated her sanctuary. He would not get away with it. The final, sickening crash of the willow's main trunk reverberated through the quiet street, a death knell that seemed to shake the very foundations of Evelyn's home. The workmen, their task completed, began the methodical process of cutting the felled giant into manageable sections, their movements devoid of any emotion. To them, it was just another job. To Evelyn, it was the dismemberment of a beloved friend. The vibrant green canopy that had once offered shade and solace was now a brutal testament to Bill Redford's arbitrary power, a gaping wound in the landscape and in her soul. Sawdust, like a perverse snowfall, coated everything, numbly. Evelyn retreated into her house, the acrid smell of chain oil and mutilated wood clinging to her clothes. She sank onto the sofa, the sounds from outside, the whine of the saw, the thud of logs being loaded onto a truck, a relentless torment. Her gaze drifted to the wall where a framed photo of David sat. His smiling face, full of life and optimism, seemed to mock her present despair. They cut it down, David, she whispered, the words catching in her throat. They cut down our tree. The silence in the house was now heavy, oppressive. The large front window, which once framed the dancing leaves of the willow, now offered an unobstructed, stark view of the street, of Redford's meticulously manicured lawn across the way. It felt exposed, vulnerable. The willow had been a shield, not just visually, but emotionally. It had been her green sanctuary, a daily affirmation of life and remembrance. Now there was just emptiness, a raw, undeniable void. Hours passed in a blur of grief and simmering rage. The workmen eventually departed, leaving behind a neatly cleared space where the willow had stood, its absence more potent than its presence ever was. Only the massive, flat stump remained, an ugly scar on her otherwise carefully tended garden, a constant reminder of the morning's brutality. Some neighbors cast curious, perhaps sympathetic glances as they passed, but no one approached. The HOA's power, it seemed, extended to fostering a climate of non-interference. As dusk began to settle, painting the Seattle sky in hues of bruised purple and gray, Evelyn's initial paralysis began to recede, replaced by a steely resolve. Redford had spoken of bylaws, of notifications she had never received. He had acted with the smug certainty of a man who believed himself untouchable. She wouldn't let this stand. This wasn't just about a tree, it was about the abuse of power, the casual cruelty, the dismissal of something sacred. Her mind turned to Nadine Lee. Nadine, 33, was a sharp, tenacious environmental woman and the daughter of one of Evelyn's oldest friends. They had a warm, almost familial bond, and Nadine possessed a fierce sense of justice that Evelyn desperately needed right now. Pulling out her phone, her fingers still trembling slightly, Evelyn dialed. "Evelyn? Hi, what's up?" Nadine's cheerful voice was a stark contrast to the gloom that enveloped Evelyn. "Nadine, something terrible has happened." Evelyn recounted the morning's events, her voice thick with emotion, but laced with an undercurrent of cold fury. She described the chainsaw, Redford's pronouncements, the destruction of the willow, and her certainty that she had received no prior warning. There was a pause on the other end of the line, then Nadine's voice, stripped of its earlier cheer, returned, low and serious. "He did what Evelyn. That's outrageous. An HOA can't just unilaterally decide to destroy a significant tree on private property without irrefutable proof of hazard and proper, verifiable notification, especially a tree with that kind of personal significance. He claimed it was a hazard, a blight, and that letters and emails were sent," Evelyn said, pacing her living room. "I swear to you, Nadine, I received nothing. He was so dismissive, so arrogant. HOA presidents like Redford often operate like petty tyrants in their little fiefdoms," Nadine said, a note of familiar exasperation in her voice. She dealt with her share of HOA overreach cases. "Okay, first things first. Don't touch anything. Don't clean up any remaining debris beyond what they took. Take pictures, lots of them. The stump, the space where it was, any damage to your property, even the sawdust. Document everything." Evelyn looked at the large pale circle of the stump, stark against the darkening lawn. "I will." "Good. Secondly, I want you to try and find any documentation you have related to the tree. Did you ever register it with the city as a significant tree? Perhaps any old photos showing its size and health over the years. Any correspondence with the HOA about your landscaping in the past, positive or negative." Evelyn's mind flashed back, years ago. After a particularly strong windstorm had swept through Seattle, there had been a citywide initiative encouraging homeowners to register exceptional trees noteworthy for their size, age, or historical significance. She remembered filling out a form, proud of her willow. She'd even received a small, unassuming certificate. It was tucked away somewhere in her study, in a box labeled House Misc. I think I might have," Evelyn said, a flicker of something igniting within her. "The city had a program for heritage trees or something similar. I think I registered the willow." Nadine's voice sharpened with interest. "If that tree was officially recognized by the city, Evelyn, then the HOA has potentially overstepped its authority in a major way. They might have needed a city permit to remove it, regardless of their own bylaws. This could be more than just an HOA dispute. This could be a municipal violation." This was the twist, the escalation Evelyn hadn't dared hope for. If the tree was protected by the city, Redford's actions were not just callous, they were potentially illegal. "I'll look for it right now," Evelyn said, a surge of adrenaline momentarily eclipsing her sorrow. "Do that?" And Evelyn, Nadine added, her voice softening. "I am so sorry about the willow. I know how much it meant to you. We're going to look into this. And if Redford and the HOA acted improperly, we'll make them accountable." "Thank you, Nadine. That means more than you know." After the call, Evelyn headed straight for her study. The room was lined with bookshelves, overflowing with history tomes and academic journals. She located the box labeled House Misc and began to sift through old receipts, appliance manuals, and forgotten warranties. Her heart pounded. What if she was mistaken? What if she'd never actually sent the form, or it had been rejected? Then, near the bottom of the box, her fingers brushed against a slightly thicker piece of cardstock. She pulled it out. It was a certificate from the City of Seattle's Department of Parks and Recreation, dated over a decade prior. It officially designated the Salix babylonica at her address as a recognized heritage tree due to its significant size, aesthetic contribution to the neighborhood, and cultural value to the owner. Evelyn stared at the certificate, a triumphant, almost fierce joy blooming amidst her grief. Bill Redford hadn't just destroyed her tree, he had, in his arrogant ignorance, potentially flouted city regulations. He had spoken of bylaws and notifications, but had he checked if the tree he was so eager to destroy was a recognized city landmark? The fight had just found its weapon. This piece of paper was more than just recognition. It was leverage. It was proof that her willow was not just her tree, but a tree acknowledged by the city itself. Redford's assertion that it was a mere blight suddenly seemed not only cruel but demonstrably false in the eyes of a higher authority than his precious HOA. A new energy coursed through Evelyn. The battle lines were drawn. He had brought the chainsaw. She would bring the law. The following Monday morning, Evelyn, armed with the Heritage Tree Certificate and a series of stark photographs of the denuded stump and the once majestic willow, met Nadine at her downtown Seattle law office. The space was modern, minimalist, yet buzzed with an undercurrent of focused energy. Nadine, dressed in a sharp charcoal suit, exuded competence. She examined the certificate with a grim satisfaction. "This is excellent, Evelyn," Nadine stated, tapping the document. "This changes the entire complexion of the case. An HOA bylaw cannot supersede a city ordinance protecting a recognized heritage tree. If they didn't go through the city's process for removing such a tree, which I highly doubt they did, then Bill Redford has exposed the HOA to significant legal and financial repercussions." "So, what's our first move?" Evelyn asked, feeling a sliver of hope for the first time since the chainsaw had roared to life. The image of David's smile, usually a comfort, had been haunting her, overlaid with the brutal destruction of his living memorial. Now, perhaps, there was a path to honoring him again. First, a cease and desist letter to the HOA, specifically to Mr. Redford, demanding they halt any further landscaping alterations on your property and preserve all documentation related to their decision-making process for the tree removal. Nadine explained, "We'll also include a copy of this heritage tree certificate and state our intent to pursue legal action for damages, which include the cost of replacing a mature tree of similar stature, which is astronomical, and potentially emotional distress. We will also be formally notifying the City of Seattle's Department of Parks and Recreation and the Department of Construction and Inspections about the unauthorized destruction of a heritage tree." Evelyn nodded. "Will he take it seriously?" Nadine gave a wry smile. When a letter arrives on the letterhead of a law firm known for taking on environmental and municipal cases, and it outlines clear legal violations, even the most arrogant HOA president tends to sit up and take notice, especially when we hint at potential personal liability for board members if they acted with gross negligence. Over the next few days, Nadine's office moved swiftly. The letter was dispatched, and official complaints were lodged with the relevant city departments. Evelyn, meanwhile, began her own quiet investigation. She spoke to a few of her more approachable neighbors, those who had privately expressed sympathy but were wary of openly challenging the HOA. She learned that Redford had become increasingly autocratic in his running of the HOA over the past year. Several residents felt he had a personal vendetta against anyone whose property didn't conform to his narrow vision of perfect curb appeal. Whispers circulated about inflated invoices for community landscaping projects he'd championed, projects that always seemed to involve his preferred contractors. One elderly neighbor, Mrs. Henderson, who had lived in Maple Leaf for over 40 years, confided in Evelyn, "That Bill Redford," she said, her voice a low conspiratorial murmur over the fence. "He's always had a bee in his bonnet about trees that shed too much. Complained for years about my beautiful maple. Said the leaves were too much work for the street cleaners. Your willow, dear. It was magnificent, but it was exuberant. And Bill doesn't like exuberant." This painted a picture of Redford not just as a stickler for rules, but as someone imposing his personal, almost obsessive preferences on the entire community, possibly for reasons beyond simple aesthetics. The official response from the HOA, when it finally came a week later, was dismissive, almost arrogant. Penned by Redford himself, it reiterated his stance that the tree was a hazard and an eyesore, that the HOA had acted within its rights according to their bylaws, and that Evelyn's heritage tree certificate was either not on file with the HOA or irrelevant to the pressing concerns of safety and community standards. He even suggested that the certificate might be outdated or invalid. He accused Evelyn of being overly emotional and of trying to circumvent legitimate HOA governance. "He's doubling down," Evelyn said, her voice tight with anger as she read the letter over the phone to Nadine. "Of course, he is," Nadine replied calmly. "Bullies always do, until they hit a brick wall. His bluster is predictable. The fact that he's directly addressing the certificate means we've got his attention. He's trying to discredit it. Now, we see what the city says." The brick wall Redford was about to hit began to materialize a few days later. An official from the Seattle Department of Construction and Inspections SDCI contacted Nadine. They had cross-referenced the Heritage Tree database with permit applications. There was no record of any permit being issued for the removal of Evelyn's willow. Furthermore, the removal of a designated heritage tree without a permit was a serious violation of city code, carrying potential fines for each day the violation persisted, and a requirement for restitution, often meaning the costly replacement of the tree with one of comparable size, or multiple smaller trees. The SDCI sent an inspector to Evelyn's property. He meticulously documented the stump, took measurements, and interviewed Evelyn. He then paid a visit to Bill Redford. The shift in power began subtly. Redford, who had been so quick to dismiss Evelyn, found himself facing an official city inquiry. His confident bluster. Evelyn later heard from a relieved Mrs. Henderson, who had witnessed the inspector's arrival at Redford's house, seemed to deflate somewhat when confronted with municipal regulations rather than a grieving homeowner. Then came the real bombshell. Nadine, through a Freedom of Information Act request to the city regarding past HOA activities and any complaints filed against them, uncovered something Redford clearly hadn't anticipated becoming public. It turned out that 2 years prior, Redford himself had been cited by the city for improperly removing a mature cherry tree from the common area of the HOA without a permit, a tree that several residents had been fond of. He had paid a fine and had been warned about future violations. "This is gold. Evelyn," Nadine said, her voice alight with triumph. "This isn't just about negligence concerning your tree. It's a pattern of behavior." He knew the rules. He'd been penalized for breaking them before. This demonstrates willfulness, a deliberate disregard for city ordinances. This makes our case for punitive damages much stronger, and it severely undermines his credibility and his "I didn't know" or "the bylaw is king" defense. This revelation recontextualized Redford's actions. It wasn't just about a dislike for messy trees or a rigid adherence to his idea of aesthetics. It was about a man who believed he was above the rules that applied to everyone else. a man who had a history of flouting regulations when they inconvenienced his plans. His attack on Evelyn's willow now seemed less like an impersonal HOA action and more like a personal vendetta, or at least a reckless assertion of his own dominance, made with the knowledge he was likely breaking the rules again. Evelyn felt a grim satisfaction. The pain of losing the willow was still a raw ache, but it was now mingled with a sense of impending justice. Redford had tried to silence her, to bulldoze her grief and her rights. But in his arrogance, he had forgotten that history, whether it was the history of a beloved tree or his own past misdeeds, had a way of coming to light. Nadine suggested a meeting. Let's present him with what we have now, including his prior violation. We'll offer the HOA a chance to settle, a full public apology, replacement of the tree with the largest viable specimen, compensation for Evelyn, and an agreement for mandatory training for the HOA board on city environmental codes. If he refuses, we file the lawsuit, and his past actions become a matter of public record in a court case. The HOA members might not be too pleased to learn their president has a history of costly violations they might end up paying for. The power had indeed begun to shift. Evelyn, the grieving professor, was now backed by the weight of city law and Redford's own documented misconduct. The memory of the willow still brought tears to her eyes, but now they were also tears of resolve. She would see this through, not just for David, not just for her tree, but for every resident who had ever felt powerless against the petty tyranny of a man like Bill Redford. The HOA board meeting was held in the sterile, linoleum-floored community clubhouse, a room usually reserved for potlucks and holiday parties. Tonight, however, the atmosphere was anything but festive. Bill Redford sat at the head of a long folding table, flanked by the other 4 board members, 2 men and 2 women who looked increasingly uncomfortable. Evelyn and Nadine sat opposite them, a neat stack of documents between them, including the damning evidence of Redford's prior citation. Redford opened the meeting with a forced attempt at his usual authoritative bluster. Well, Ms. Lee, Professor Kim, we're here, though frankly, I still believe this is a gross overreaction to a necessary property management decision. We have bylaws for a reason. Nadine leaned forward, her voice calm but firm, cutting through his pretense. Mr. Redford, what we have here is not an overreaction, but a direct consequence of your unauthorized destruction of a city-recognized heritage tree. A tree, I might add, that held profound personal significance for Professor Kim, a significance you summarily dismissed. She slid a copy of the heritage tree certificate and the SDCI violation notice across the table. As you know, the city is already pursuing this. Fines are accumulating daily. They will also mandate restitution, the planting of a mature tree, or several smaller ones, at considerable expense to the HOA, an expense your members, she glanced meaningfully at the other board members, will ultimately bear. One of the female board members, a Mrs. Albright, paled slightly. Considerable expense, potentially tens of thousands of dollars, depending on the size and type of replacement tree the city deems appropriate, Nadine stated factually. And that's before we even discuss Professor Kim's personal damages for the loss of her property and the emotional distress caused. Redford scoffed, though his bravado was visibly cracking. Emotional distress for a tree, that's absurd. Is it, Mr. Redford? Evelyn spoke for the first time, her voice low but carrying a powerful current of emotion. That tree was a living memorial to my colleague, David, murdered on 9/11. I planted it in his memory. It lived and breathed with his memory for 22 years. You didn't just cut down wood, you desecrated a tribute. You did so without warning, without compassion, and, as it turns out, without legal authority. Her gaze was unwavering, and for the first time, Redford looked away. Nadine then played her trump card. She distributed copies of Redford's previous city citation for illegal tree removal. What's particularly troubling, and what elevates this from mere negligence to willful misconduct, is this. She tapped the document. Mr. Redford, It appears you have a history of illegally removing trees and disregarding city ordinances. You were cited and fined for a similar offense 2 years ago. You knew the rules. You knew the potential consequences, yet you proceeded anyway. A stunned silence fell over the room. The other board members stared, first at the document, then at Redford, their expressions shifting from discomfort to dawning anger and betrayal. The treasurer, a quiet man named Arthur Jenkins, who meticulously managed the HOA's modest budget, looked particularly aghast. "Bill, is this true?" Mrs. Albright asked, her voice sharp. "You knew this could happen, and you didn't tell us," Redford sputtered, his face turning a deep shade of crimson. That was a different situation. A misunderstanding. "It has no bearing on this." "It has every bearing," Nadine interjected smoothly. "It demonstrates a pattern of behavior and a deliberate disregard for legal obligations, which significantly increases the HOA's liability. And potentially, Mr. Redford, your personal liability as president, acting outside the scope of informed board consent and in direct violation of known city codes." The dam of Redford's arrogance finally broke. He deflated, slumping slightly in his chair. The fight seemed to drain out of him, replaced by a sullen resentment. Arthur Jenkins cleared his throat. "Ms. Lee, what is it you and Professor Kim are seeking? Our terms for settling this and avoiding a protracted and very public lawsuit are straightforward." Nadine stated, "First, a formal written apology from the HOA and Mr. Redford to Professor Kim to be published in the community newsletter. Second, full financial responsibility for the installation of a new, mature weeping willow tree on Professor Kim's property, of the largest size commercially viable, selected in consultation with Professor Kim and a certified arborist. Third, compensation to Professor Kim for the emotional distress and the violation of her property rights. We propose a sum of $25,000. Fourth, Mr. Redford's immediate resignation as president and from the HOA board. And finally, mandatory training for all current and future HOA board members on municipal codes and environmental regulations related to property management in Seattle. The board members exchanged uneasy glances. Redford started to protest. "Resignation, that's outrageous." But Mrs. Albright cut him off. "Bill, be quiet for a moment." She looked at Nadine. "Those are significant terms." "They are," Nadine agreed, "but they are far less damaging than the public fallout and financial penalties of a lawsuit, especially given Mr. Redford's prior record. The city will impose its own fines and replacement requirements regardless. Our settlement seeks to address the harm done to Professor Kim and ensure this doesn't happen again." Evelyn watched as the reality of the situation settled upon the board. Their loyalty to Redford, if it ever truly existed beyond his domineering presence, evaporated in the face of financial liability and public embarrassment. After a tense, whispered consultation amongst themselves, while Redford fumed silently, Mrs. Albright turned back to Nadine and Evelyn. "We will need to discuss this in a closed session," she said, her tone indicating a shift in command. "However, on a preliminary basis, and without Redford's input at this juncture, most of these terms seem necessary under the circumstances, particularly his resignation." Redford looked as if he'd been slapped. The following week saw the unraveling of Bill Redford's little empire. Faced with the undeniable evidence and the prospect of a costly legal battle, his fellow board members were unwilling to wage for his sake. The HOA conceded. Redford, under immense pressure from the rest of the board, who were now fully aware of his previous transgression and the extent of his misjudgment, tendered his resignation. The letter of apology, though undoubtedly drafted with gritted teeth, was published. The process of selecting and planting a new willow was a bittersweet one for Evelyn. No tree could ever truly replace the one she had nurtured for over 2 decades, the one intertwined with David's memory. But as a magnificent 10-year-old weeping willow, its branches already beginning to sweep gracefully, was carefully installed in her front yard, a sense of peace began to settle over her. It wasn't the same, but it was a new beginning, a testament to resilience. The substantial check from the HOA, covering the settlement, felt less like a victory payout and more like a painful acknowledgement of the wrong she had endured. Evelyn decided to donate a significant portion of it to a 9/11 memorial fund in David's name and to a local nonprofit dedicated to preserving urban green spaces. The neighborhood, too, seemed to breathe a collective sigh of relief. With Redford gone, a more collaborative and less punitive atmosphere began to permeate the HOA. Mrs. Albright, who took over as interim president, reached out to Evelyn, expressing her personal regret for what had happened and her commitment to ensuring the board operated with more transparency and respect for residents moving forward. One crisp autumn afternoon, nearly a year after the old willow's destruction, Evelyn stood by her front window, a cup of genmaicha tea warming her hands. The new willow swayed gently in the breeze, its young leaves catching the sunlight. It was smaller, its history shorter, but it was alive, and it was hers. Students from her History of American Protest seminar were due any minute for an informal outdoor discussion, something she'd never felt comfortable hosting under the shadow of Redford's reign. The doorbell rang. It was Nadine, a bottle of wine in hand. "Thought I'd come see how the new Sentinel is doing," Nadine said, smiling warmly as she looked out at the tree. "And its guardian?" "We're both doing well," Evelyn replied, a genuine smile gracing her lips. "Thank you, Nadine, for everything. You were the one who stood your ground. Evelyn, you fought for David's memory, for your rights. You showed them that history and heart can't be so easily paved over." As they sat in Evelyn's living room, the late afternoon sun casting long shadows, Evelyn felt the last vestiges of the cold fury replaced by a quiet strength. The scar on the lawn was gone, covered by new grass and a new tree. The scar in her heart was fading, not erased, but integrated into the ongoing narrative of her life. Bill Redford was a footnote, a cautionary tale of arrogance brought low. The willow in its new incarnation was a symbol not of loss, but of endurance, and the powerful, enduring truth that even in the face of petty tyranny, justice, like a well-tended tree, could take root and flourish. The entire neighborhood learned that day that while one man's ego could fell a tree, one woman's resolve could move a community towards healing and respect. Evelyn Kim's courageous stand against an overreaching HOA transformed personal tragedy into a community's fight for respect and remembrance. The battle for the willow tree revealed that even in the face of entrenched power, one voice, armed with truth, can bring about profound change. Thank you for joining Evelyn's journey. Please like, subscribe, and share your thoughts below.